I was 17 standard years old when I first learned what true fear meant, and it had nothing to do with the orc raids that had been plaguing the outer settlements of our world for the past 3 months. It had everything to do with the Emperor's angels who came to save us. My name is Jerick Voss, and I was a munitions runner for the 47th Cardan Planetary Defense Force when the Space Marines of the Iron Templars chapter arrived on our world of Gemros Prime. At the time, I thought I understood war. I had seen men torn apart by orc cleavers, watched good soldiers reduced to screaming meat by alien firearms, and had spent sleepless nights listening to the howls of the greenskin hordes as they butchered their way through the agricultural districts. I had held the guts of my squad leader inside his belly while he died, whispering prayers to the God Emperor through blood-frothed lips. I thought I had witnessed the worst that this galaxy could offer a mortal man. I was wrong. So catastrophically, fundamentally wrong that even now, decades later, as I sit in this confession booth dictating my account to the servo skull recorder, my hands still shake. When I remember that first moment, I saw one of the Emperor's finest warriors up close. It was dawn on the 43rd day of the siege. The orcs had broken through the eastern wall of Hive Tertius during the night, and what remained of our regiment had been pulled back to the central plaza to make our last stand. We were exhausted, running low on ammunition, and most of the men had that hollow look in their eyes that comes when a soldier realizes he's probably going to die before the sun sets. I was crouched behind an overturned cargo hauler, checking my Las Riffles power pack for what felt like the 100th time that morning when the transport ships arrived. The sound came first, a deep, thrumming roar that seemed to emanate from the very air itself, so low and powerful that I felt it in my bones before I heard it with my ears. The debris around my feet began to vibrate, and somewhere behind me a man started weeping with what I initially thought was terror. Then I looked up and saw the Thunderhawks descending through the morning mist like the wrath of the Emperor made manifest, and I understood that the soldier wasn't weeping from fear, but from relief so profound it had broken something inside him. The dropships were massive, each one easily the size of a hab block, their hulls painted in the deep blue and silver livery of the Iron Templars. They moved with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, settling onto the plaza with precision that spoke of pilots whose reflexes operated on an entirely different level than baseline humanity. Steam hissed from their landing thrusters, and the acrid smell of promethium exhaust filled the air as their assault ramps lowered with hydraulic sighs that sounded almost like breathing. That's when I saw my first Space Marine. He emerged from the lead Thunderhawk like something out of the most fevered imaginings of an Imperial artist, but no painting or sculpture could have prepared me for the reality of an Adeptus Astartes in the flesh. He was enormous, easily 8 feet tall even without the additional height provided by his power armor's backpack, and broad enough that he had to turn slightly sideways to clear the transport's ramp. His armor was a masterwork of ceramite plating and adamantium joints, painted in the chapter's colors and covered in purity seals that fluttered in the morning breeze like prayer flags. His helmet's eye lenses glowed with a pale blue light that seemed to burn with the cold fire of distant stars. But it wasn't his size that struck me most profoundly, though that was certainly overwhelming enough. It wasn't even the casual way he carried a bolter that would have required 2 normal men to lift, or the ceremonial sword hanging at his hip that was longer than I was tall. What truly made my blood freeze in my veins was the presence he radiated, an aura of barely contained violence and absolute certainty that pressed against my consciousness like a physical weight. I have spent years trying to find adequate words to describe that sensation, and I have always failed. The closest I can come is to say that standing near a Space Marine is like standing at the edge of an active volcano. You are suddenly, viscerally aware that you are in the presence of something far more powerful than yourself, something that could annihilate you without effort or thought, and yet something that serves a purpose so much greater than your own existence that your death or survival is utterly irrelevant to its function. It is humbling and terrifying and awe-inspiring all at once, and it fundamentally changes your understanding of your place in the universe. The Iron Templar, I later learned his name was Brother Sergeant Thorak, swept his gaze across the assembled guardsmen, and I felt that pale blue light pass over me like a searchlight. For just a moment, perhaps half a heartbeat, those inhuman eyes focused on me, and I experienced something that I can only describe as being truly seen for the first time in my life. Not looked at, not observed, but seen with a clarity and intensity that seemed to peer directly into my soul and weigh its contents against some unknowable standard. I failed that evaluation. I knew it immediately, with the same certainty that I knew my own name. Whatever Brother Sergeant Thorak was looking for in that instant, courage, faith, worthiness, I don't know. I didn't possess it. His gaze moved on without acknowledgement, dismissing me as casually as I might dismiss an insect, and I realized that I had been holding my breath. When I finally exhaled, it came out as a shuddering gasp that sounded embarrassingly loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the plaza. More Space Marines emerged from the other transports, each one just as imposing as the first, each one radiating that same overwhelming sense of barely leashed power. They moved with purpose and coordination that spoke of decades of training and battlefield experience, checking their weapons and equipment with economical movements that wasted no time or energy. Their voices, when they spoke to each other, were deep and resonant, carrying clearly across the plaza despite the fact that they seemed to be conversing at normal volume. The words themselves were in battle cant, the ritual language of the Astartes, and though I couldn't understand their meaning, the sound of it made something deep in my hindbrain recoil, in instinctive recognition of a predator's communication. Our regimental commander, Colonel Hask, approached the lead Space Marine with visible trepidation. Hask was a good officer, a veteran of 3 campaigns who had earned the respect of his men through competence and courage under fire. I had seen him face down charging orc knobs with nothing but a chainsword and a prayer, had watched him maintain discipline and morale even as our position became increasingly untenable. But as he walked toward Brother Sergeant Thorak, he looked like a child approaching a stern parent, his usual confident bearing replaced by something that bordered on civility. "My lord," Hask said, his voice carefully controlled but unable to entirely hide a tremor of nervousness. "Colonel Hask, commanding officer of the 47th Cardan Planetary Defense Force, we are at your disposal." Brother Sergeant Thorak looked down at the colonel for a long moment, and I could see Hask physically struggle not to step backward under the weight of that gaze. When the Space Marine finally spoke, his voice carried the deep, artificial resonance of Vox Grill modulation, but underneath that technological distortion was something fundamentally inhuman, a quality that suggested vocal cords and lung capacity designed for purposes beyond normal speech. "Colonel, your men have fought well to hold this position. The Emperor honors their sacrifice." Each word was precisely enunciated, carrying a weight of authority that made the air itself seem heavier. "We will take tactical command from this point forward. Your forces will provide support as directed." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even really a statement of intent. It was simply a declaration of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who had never encountered effective resistance to their will. Colonel Hask nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly, and I saw his adjutant visibly relax as the weight of command responsibility was lifted from their shoulders. "Of course, my lord. What are your orders?" Brother Sergeant Thorak turned toward the eastern wall, where the sounds of orc war chants and crude machinery echoed across the rubble-strewn streets. His helmet's optical arrays whirred softly as they adjusted focus, and I had the unsettling realization that he was probably seeing and analyzing details that would be invisible to baseline human senses, even with the assistance of magnification equipment. "The Xenos have established a forward position in the industrial sector. They are using it to stage raids against the remaining civilian population while they bring up heavier equipment for a final assault. This is unacceptable." He turned back to Colonel Hask, and somehow I could feel the intensity of his attention even though his helmet completely concealed his features. "We will eliminate this position and then push forward to their primary staging area. Your men will secure our flanks and provide ammunition resupply as needed. Understood, my lord. How long do you estimate? 3 hours, Brother Sergeant Thorak interrupted. The Xenos will be routed or dead within 3 hours. The casual confidence in that statement was breathtaking. We had been fighting the Orcs for over a month, had seen entire companies ground down to nothing against their seemingly endless numbers and ferocious close combat capabilities. The idea that 30 Space Marines, I had counted them as they disembarked, could accomplish in 3 hours what 3 regiments of Imperial Guard had failed to achieve in weeks should have seemed like delusional arrogance. Instead, delivered in that inhuman monotone, it sounded like a simple statement of fact. I was selected for the ammunition resupply detail, along with 15 other men whose job it would be to follow the Space Marines at a safe distance and provide additional bolter rounds as needed. It should have been an honor, a chance to witness the Emperor's finest warriors in action. Instead, as we gathered our equipment and prepared to move out, I felt a growing sense of dread that I couldn't entirely explain. Something about the way the Iron Templars moved, the casual way they handled weapons that could level buildings, the complete absence of anything resembling normal human emotion in their bearing. It all combined to create an impression that was more deeply unsettling than merely intimidating. Brother Corvin was the Space Marine assigned to coordinate with our resupply team. He was marginally smaller than Brother Sergeant Thorak, though that still made him enormous by any normal standard, and his armor bore the distinctive markings of a Devastator Marine specialist. When he approached us to explain our role in the upcoming operation, I had my second close encounter with an Adeptus Astartes, and it was no less disturbing than the first. You will maintain a distance of no less than 50 meters from our forward positions at all times, he said, his artificially modulated voice carrying clearly despite the ambient noise of the plaza. When ammunition resupply is required, one of you will advance to the designated position when called. You will not attempt to provide tactical support, medical assistance, or any other aid unless specifically requested. You will not interfere with our operations in any way. Is this understood? We all nodded, probably more vigorously than was strictly necessary, but Brother Corvin's helmet turned to fix each of us with that unsettling blue-lensed stare in turn. When his attention focused on me, I once again felt that sensation of being completely exposed, as if my thoughts and intentions were being catalogued and evaluated by some vast and inhuman intelligence. This time, however, I managed to meet his gaze without flinching, though it required every ounce of discipline I possessed. You, he said, and I felt my heart rate spike. Voss. Jerick. Service record shows 3 commendations for courage under fire. You will serve as team leader for this operation. I opened my mouth to respond, but he had already turned away, dismissing me as quickly and completely as he had acknowledged me. The other men in the detail looked at me with expressions that mixed envy with pity. Being singled out by a Space Marine was theoretically an honor, but it also meant that I would be the one responsible if anything went wrong. Given the legends I had heard about Astartes' discipline and their expectations of baseline humans, that was not a responsibility I welcomed. The Iron Templars moved out exactly on schedule, their formation a perfect example of tactical coordination that had been refined over centuries of warfare. Brother Sergeant Thorak took point, his bolter held at ready position as his helmet's sensor arrays swept continuously for threats. Behind him came 2 tactical squads in standard patrol formation, their movements coordinated with the kind of precision that spoke of countless hours of drill and real combat experience. Brother Corvin's Devastator squad brought up the rear, their heavy weapons providing overwatch as the main force advanced. Our resupply team followed at the prescribed distance, and I quickly discovered that keeping up with Space Marines, even when they weren't making any particular effort to move quickly, required near constant jogging. Their casual walking pace was simply too fast for normal human legs to match with ordinary strides. Within the first 10 minutes, I was breathing hard and sweating despite the cool morning air, and I could see that the other members of the team were struggling even more than I was. The Orc positions were located in what had once been the primary manufacturing district of Hive Tertius, a maze of factories, warehouses, and processing plants that the greenskins had turned into a crude but effective fortress. As we approached the outer perimeter, the sounds of alien activity grew steadily louder. The clang of metal on metal as they reinforced their positions, the guttural roar of their machinery, and the constant background noise of their shouted communications in their brutish language. Brother Sergeant Thorak called a halt at the edge of what had once been a central courtyard, now filled with rubble and the twisted wreckage of civilian vehicles. He raised one massive gauntleted hand, and the entire Space Marine force froze instantly, becoming so motionless that they might have been statues. For nearly 5 minutes, nothing happened. The Iron Templars simply stood there, their helmet sensors undoubtedly gathering and analyzing intelligence about the enemy positions ahead, while we resupply personnel, tried to catch our breath, and wondered what was happening. Then, without any visible signal or communication, they attacked. I have witnessed many battles in my time as a soldier, but nothing had prepared me for the sheer, overwhelming violence of a Space Marine assault. They moved with a coordination and lethality that was both beautiful and terrifying, their bolters speaking in controlled bursts that sent mass-reactive shells into Orc positions with devastating precision. The distinctive crack boom of bolter fire was almost continuous, punctuated by the deeper roar of Brother Corvin's heavy bolter as it swept entire sections of the enemy fortifications with explosive rounds. The Orcs responded with their typical ferocity, charging out of their positions with bellowing war cries and crude but effective weapons. Against Imperial Guard forces, such a charge would have been devastating. Orcs are physically powerful, nearly fearless, and equipped with weapons designed for close-quarters carnage. Against the Iron Templars, it was simply suicide with extra steps. Brother Sergeant Thorak met the first wave of attackers with his chainsaw drawn, the weapon's adamantine teeth screaming as they bit into Orc flesh and bone. I watched him decapitate 2 greenskins with a single horizontal sweep, their heads flying through the air in sprays of dark blood while their bodies continued stumbling forward for several steps before collapsing. Another Orc, larger than the others and wearing crude armor made from scavenged metal plates, brought a massive cleaver down toward the Space Marine's helmet in a blow that would have split a normal man in half. Brother Sergeant Thorak caught the weapon's haft in his free hand, stopping the attack completely, then drove his bolter's muzzle into the Orc's chest and fired 3 rounds at point-blank range. The mass-reactive shells detonated inside the alien's torso, and its upper body simply disintegrated in a shower of gore. What struck me most about the combat was not the violence itself. War is always violent, and I had seen plenty of death and dismemberment in my service, but the complete absence of anything resembling emotion or effort on the part of the Space Marines. They killed with the same mechanical precision that they had displayed in every other aspect of their behavior, showing no signs of anger, fear, excitement, or even particular satisfaction at their success. It was less like watching warriors in battle and more like watching pieces of extremely sophisticated machinery performing the function for which they had been designed. The assault lasted exactly 17 minutes. I know this because Brother Corvin called for ammunition resupply at the 12-minute mark, and I was checking my chrono when the last Orc died 5 minutes later. In that brief span of time, the Iron Templars had killed approximately 200 greenskins and completely destroyed what had been a fortified position that our regiment had spent weeks trying to reduce. They did this without taking a single casualty, and with ammunition expenditure that was actually below their pre-mission estimates. As I approached Brother Corvin's position to deliver the requested bolter rounds, I got my closest look yet at the aftermath of Space Marine combat operations. The courtyard was carpeted with Orc corpses, their crude weapons scattered among the debris of their destroyed fortifications. The air was thick with the smell of burned propellant, spilled blood, and the distinctive ozone scent that bolter shells leave behind when their mass-reactive charges detonate. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the screams of wounded Orcs who had survived the initial assault but were now dying slowly from their injuries. Brother Corvin was standing beside what had once been an Orc heavy weapons position, methodically reloading his heavy bolter with movements that were both economical and practiced. His armor showed no signs of damage despite having been at the center of the heaviest fighting, and his breathing, audible through his helmet's Vox grill, was perfectly regular. When I approached with the ammunition container, he turned toward me with that same unsettling attention I had experienced earlier. "Adequate performance," he said, which I realized was probably the closest thing to praise I was likely to receive from an Astartes. "Maintain current positioning. Next objective, in 6 minutes." I nodded and withdrew to rejoin the rest of the resupply team. But something about the exchange bothered me in a way that I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't until we were moving toward the next orc position that I realized what it was. Brother Corvin had spoken to me exactly as he might have addressed a piece of equipment that had performed within acceptable parameters. There had been no recognition of me as an individual, no acknowledgement of my service or sacrifice, nothing that suggested he saw me as anything more than a tool designed for a specific purpose. It was a level of dehumanization that went beyond simple military professionalism into something altogether more unsettling. The second engagement followed the same pattern as the first methodical intelligence gathering, followed by swift and devastating assault, followed by complete enemy annihilation. This time, however, I was positioned where I could observe Brother Sergeant Thorak more closely during the actual fighting, and what I saw changed my understanding of Space Marines in ways that I am still struggling to process decades later. The orcs in this position had learned from the fate of their comrades and had prepared accordingly, setting up overlapping fields of fire and prepared defensive positions that would have given even veteran Imperial Guard units significant trouble. They had also brought up heavier weapons, including several crude but effective artillery pieces that began shelling the Iron Templars' approach route as soon as they were detected. It should have been a much more challenging engagement, requiring careful tactical coordination and probably resulting in at least some Space Marine casualties. Instead, Brother Sergeant Thorak simply walked through the artillery barrage. I don't mean that he ran from cover to cover, using tactical movement to minimize his exposure to the incoming shells. I don't mean that he advanced under covering fire from his battle brothers, or that he used some form of technological protection to shield himself from the explosions. I mean that he walked, in a perfectly straight line, directly through a concentrated bombardment that was churning the ground around him into a cratered wasteland, and the shells simply failed to kill him. Several scored direct hits. I saw one large caliber round strike him center mass and detonate in a flash of fire and flying shrapnel that should have reduced even power armor to scrap metal. When the smoke cleared, Brother Sergeant Thorak was still walking forward at exactly the same pace, his armor scorched but intact, his movements showing no sign that he had been affected in any way by an explosion that would have vaporized anything resembling a normal human being. By the time he reached the orc gun positions, their crews had stopped firing and were staring at him in what I can only describe as superstitious terror. Orcs are not noted for their capacity for fear. They are aggressive, violent creatures who typically respond to threats with increased aggression rather than retreat. But as Brother Sergeant Thorak approached their position, walking calmly through devastation that should have killed him a dozen times over, several of the greenskins actually broke and ran. He killed them anyway, of course. Space Marines do not take prisoners, and fleeing enemies are simply targets moving in a predictable direction. His bolter fire tracked the running orcs with mechanical precision, each shot placed with the kind of accuracy that spoke of reflexes and targeting capabilities far beyond baseline human limitations. Within moments, the courtyard was once again silent, except for the settling sounds of debris and the distant crackling of fires. This time, when Brother Corvin called for ammunition resupply, I noticed something that I had missed during the previous engagement. As I approached his position, carrying the heavy container of bolter shells, I could see that he was not alone. There were other figures moving among the orc corpses, figures in power armor identical to his own, but somehow different in a way that I couldn't immediately identify. It took me several seconds to realize what I was seeing, and when I did, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The figures were Space Marines, but they were not members of the Iron Templars force that I had been following. Their armor was the same deep blue and silver, bore the same chapter symbols and purity seals. But the warriors inside were different. Their movements were subtly wrong, lacking the fluid precision that characterized their battle brothers. Their heads turned too far when tracking targets. Their limbs bent at angles that suggested joint flexibility beyond even the enhanced range of motion provided by power armor. And their eye lenses, when visible, did not glow with the steady blue light of normal Astartes optical systems, but flickered with patterns that hurt to look at directly. One of them was feeding, I don't know what else to call it. The figure, I could not bring myself to think of it as a space marine. Despite the armor was crouched over the corpse of a particularly large orc, its helmet removed to reveal features that were simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. The face was roughly human in overall structure, but the skin was pale to the point of translucency, showing the dark network of veins beneath. The eyes were completely black, lacking any visible iris or pupil, and the mouth was filled with teeth that were far too sharp and numerous for any creature that had ever been baseline human. As I watched, frozen in horror, the thing that wore space marine armor bit into the orc's neck and began to drink. The sound was wet and obscene, a combination of tearing flesh and eager swallowing that made my stomach clench with revulsion. Other similar figures were scattered throughout the courtyard, engaged in the same grotesque activity, feeding on the fallen enemies with an enthusiasm that seemed both ritualistic and deeply hungry. Brother Corvin noticed my distraction and turned to see what had captured my attention. When his gaze fell upon the feeding figures, his posture straightened slightly, the first deviation from perfect mechanical composure I had observed from any of the Iron Templars. "You will disregard what you have seen here," he said, his vox-distorted voice carrying a note of something that might have been warning. "The chapter's methods are not for civilian observation or understanding." I tried to speak, to ask what those things were, and why they wore the sacred armor of the Emperor's angels, but my voice seemed to have deserted me entirely. Brother Corvin studied me for a long moment, his helmet's sensors no doubt analyzing my physiological state and cataloguing the signs of shock and horror that I was displaying. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something that was almost gentle, though the artificial quality of his vox grill made it difficult to be certain. "These are difficult truths, mortal. The galaxy is vast, and its enemies are manifold. Sometimes, to preserve humanity, we must employ methods that humanity would find troubling. Your faith in the Emperor is strong. I can see this in your service record and your behavior under stress. Trust that his wisdom guides all actions taken in his name, even those that seem to contradict his teachings." Before I could respond, he had taken the ammunition container from my nerveless hands and dismissed me with a gesture. As I stumbled back toward the rest of the resupply team, my mind reeling with what I had witnessed, I could hear the wet sounds of feeding continuing behind me. None of the other men seemed to have noticed anything unusual, which struck me as impossible until I realized that my position had been the only one with a clear line of sight to the courtyard where the feeding was taking place. The third and final engagement of the day took place at the Orcs' primary staging area, a converted manufacturing complex that they had been using as both a fortress and a launching point for their raids against the civilian population. Intelligence estimates suggested that it contained upward of 500 greenskins, along with their heaviest equipment and their overall commander. Under normal circumstances, reducing such a position would have required either a prolonged siege or a full-scale assault involving multiple regiments and significant artillery support. The Iron Templars attacked it with the same 30 Space Marines who had participated in the previous engagements. By this point, I should have become accustomed to the overwhelming superiority that the Astartes displayed in combat, but the sheer scale of the destruction they unleashed on the Orc stronghold was unlike anything I had previously witnessed. Brother Sergeant Thorak divided his force into 3 combat groups, each approaching the complex from a different direction, while Brother Corvin's Devastator squad provided long-range fire support from an elevated position nearly a kilometer away. The assault began with a single shot from Brother Corvin's heavy bolter, not a burst or sustained fire, but one perfectly placed round that struck something vital within the complex and triggered a secondary explosion that shook the ground beneath our feet. The blast was followed immediately by the deep, harmonic roar of tactical squad bolters as all three groups opened fire simultaneously, their coordinated salvos tearing through the Orc fortifications with methodical precision. What followed could barely be called a battle. It was more like watching a complex piece of machinery disassemble itself, each component failing in sequence as the Space Marines systematically destroyed everything capable of offering resistance. Orc defensive positions that had been constructed over weeks of careful preparation were reduced to rubble in minutes. Heavy weapons that should have been able to threaten even power armor were silenced before they could achieve effective fire. The Greenskin commander, a massive creature whose bellowing war cries had been audible from the start of the engagement, died with such sudden finality that his death scream was cut off mid-syllable. Through it all, the Iron Templars advanced with the same mechanical precision they had displayed in the earlier fights, their movements coordinated and efficient, their fire discipline perfect, their tactics textbook examples of how such an assault should be conducted. There was no waste, no excess, no deviation from optimal performance. They were, in every respect, exactly what the legends said they should be: the Emperor's perfect warriors, incapable of failure and utterly dedicated to their sacred duty. But I could no longer see them as I had that morning. The memory of those feeding figures, wearing identical armor but possessed of an alien hunger that no loyal servant of the Emperor should display, had fundamentally changed my perception of what I was witnessing. Now, when I watched Brother Sergeant Thorak cut down fleeing orcs with precise bolter fire, I found myself wondering whether his motivations were truly as pure as Imperial doctrine suggested. When I observed the perfect coordination between squad members, I questioned whether it was the result of training and dedication or something more sinister that bound them together. The engagement ended with the complete destruction of the Orc force, just as Brother Sergeant Thorak had predicted. The timing was also exactly as he had estimated. The complex fell in the final minutes of the 3-hour window he had specified. As the Iron Templars regrouped in the ruins of what had once been the manufacturing center's main assembly hall, I realized that we had just witnessed the annihilation of a force that had terrorized our world for over a month, accomplished with such efficiency that it seemed almost casual. It should have been a moment of triumph. The Orc threat to Hive Tertius had been eliminated, the civilian population was safe, and the Imperial Guard forces that had suffered so heavily during the siege had been vindicated by the arrival of the Emperor's finest warriors. Instead, as I stood among the smoking ruins and watched the Iron Templars conduct their post-battle equipment checks, I felt a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the carnage around me and everything to do with the warriors who had created it. Brother Corvin approached me as we prepared to return to the hive, and this time his attention felt different, more focused, more personal, and somehow more dangerous than it had during our previous interactions. "You have performed adequately throughout this operation," he said, his vox-distorted voice carrying the same mechanical inflection as always. "Your service record will be updated accordingly." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, but he continued studying me through his helmet's lenses with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You have questions," he said, and it was not a query, but a statement of fact. "This is understandable. Mortals often struggle to comprehend the full scope of the Emperor's plan and the methods required to fulfill it." "My lord," I managed to say, my voice sounding hoarse and uncertain even to my own ears, "I serve the Emperor faithfully. I seek only to understand my place in his design." "Understanding is not always beneficial," Brother Corvin replied. "Some truths are too large for mortal minds to contain without damage. Your faith is strong, but faith and knowledge are not always compatible." He paused, and I had the distinct impression that he was making some kind of internal calculation, weighing factors that I could not begin to guess at. "You will report to the Chapter Surf recruitment facility at coordinates 23.7.891.443 tomorrow at the 6th hour, he said finally. "Bring only what you can carry in one bag. Your service to the Imperial Guard is complete." Before I could ask what he meant, what the chapter serf recruitment facility was, or why I was being summoned there, he had turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone among the ruins with a growing sense of dread that I could not shake. That night, as I lay in my bunk in the temporary barracks that had been set up for the surviving members of the 47th Cardon, I tried to process everything I had witnessed during the day. The official reports would record the events as a textbook example of Space Marine combat effectiveness. 30 Astartes had eliminated a major Orc threat in exactly the time frame they had predicted, with 0 friendly casualties and minimal ammunition expenditure. It was the kind of success story that would be told and retold throughout the Imperial Guard as an example of what the Emperor's angels could accomplish when properly deployed. But I could not forget the sight of those feeding figures, wearing the sacred armor of the Iron Templars, but possessed of an alien hunger that seemed fundamentally incompatible with everything I had been taught about the Emperor's warriors. I could not ignore the mechanical precision with which Brother Sergeant Thorak had moved through artillery fire that should have killed him, or the casual way Brother Corven had dismissed my obvious distress at witnessing things that challenged my understanding of Imperial doctrine. Most of all, I could not shake the feeling that my summons to the chapter serf recruitment facility was not the honor it appeared to be, but something altogether more sinister. The timing seemed too convenient, my selection too deliberate for someone who had done nothing more than carry ammunition and follow orders. I had the growing suspicion that Brother Corvin's comment about some truths being too large for mortal minds was not philosophical speculation, but a practical warning about my future. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams that were filled with figures in blue and silver armor moving through endless corridors carved from living stone, their eye lenses flickering with patterns that hurt to remember upon waking. In my dreams, I walked among them, wearing robes that marked me as something less than human but more than the baseline mortals I had left behind. My reflection in the polished surfaces of their armor showed features that were subtly wrong, eyes that had learned to see things they were never meant to perceive, and a mouth that had tasted sustenance no loyal servant of the Emperor should crave. I woke several times during the night, each awakening accompanied by the lingering taste of something metallic and warm in my mouth, and by the absolute certainty that my life as Jerick Voss of the 47th Cardon Planetary Defense Force was over. The chapter serf recruitment facility was located in what had once been the administrative center of Hive Tertius, a complex of offices and meeting halls that had been hastily converted to serve the needs of the Iron Templars' logistical operations. When I arrived at the specified coordinates, carrying a single bag containing my few personal possessions, I found a queue of approximately 50 other individuals waiting outside the main entrance. Most were Imperial guardsmen like myself, though I recognized a few faces from the local Adeptus Mechanicus contingent and what appeared to be several members of the planetary nobility. What struck me most about the assembled group was not their diversity of background, but the uniformity of their expressions. Without exception, every person in that line wore the same look of barely contained anxiety, the same mixture of anticipation and dread that I had been struggling with since receiving my summons. We were all here for the same reason, and we all understood on some level that we were crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. The processing was conducted with the same mechanical efficiency that characterized everything else about Space Marine operations. We were called forward individually, subjected to various forms of medical and psychological evaluation, and then either dismissed or directed to a secondary holding area for further screening. The criteria being used to make these determinations was not obvious. Men who appeared physically and mentally superior to their peers were sometimes rejected, while others who seemed unremarkable were selected for advancement. I began to suspect that the Iron Templars were looking for something specific, some quality or characteristic that was not immediately apparent to casual observation. When my turn came, I found myself facing a figure who was clearly not a baseline human, but was also not quite a space marine. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but not to the superhuman degree that characterized the Astartes, and his movements, while precise and controlled, lacked the inhuman fluidity I had observed in Brother Sergeant Thorak and his warriors. His skin was pale, almost translucent, showing the network of veins beneath, and his eyes held a quality of depth that seemed to suggest vastly more intelligence than any normal human should possess. "Jerick Voss," he said, consulting a data slate with fingers that were just slightly too long for his hands. "Age, 17. Service record, with 3 commendations for courage under fire. Psychological profile indicates strong faith and resistance to corruption. Recommended by Brother Corvin for advanced evaluation." He looked up from the data slate and fixed me with a stare that was uncomfortably reminiscent of the attention I had received from the Space Marines themselves. Unlike their mechanically precise evaluation, however, this examination felt more personal, as if he were looking for something specific and had a good idea of whether or not I possessed it. "You witnessed the feeding," he said, "and it was not a question." Brother Corvin included this information in his recommendation. "How did it affect your faith in the Emperor?" The question was so direct, so completely without prevarication or diplomatic softening, that I was caught completely off guard. For a moment I simply stared at him, trying to process not just what he had asked, but the casual way he had acknowledged something that Brother Corvin had specifically told me to disregard. I began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. The truth was that witnessing the feeding had shaken my faith in ways that I was still struggling to understand, but admitting that seemed like exactly the kind of response that would result in my immediate rejection from whatever process this was supposed to be. "Answer, truthfully," the examiner said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been amusement. "Lies serve no purpose here. We already know more about your psychological state than you do yourself." "It troubled me," I said finally. "What I saw, it didn't match what I had been taught about the Emperor's angels. I found it difficult to reconcile with Imperial doctrine. And yet you are still here, rather than fleeing to the nearest ecclesiarchy representative to report what you witnessed. Why?" That question was even more difficult to answer, because it forced me to confront motivations that I had been trying to avoid examining too closely. Why had I not reported what I had seen? Why was I standing in this line, waiting to be processed for some purpose that had not been fully explained to me, rather than seeking guidance from the proper authorities about my crisis of faith? "Because," I said slowly, working out my thoughts as I spoke, "I think there are things about the Emperor's plan that are too complex for normal human understanding, and because I trust that his will is being served, even when the methods seem difficult." The examiner nodded, making a notation on his data slate with movements that were too fluid for baseline human joints. "Acceptable response. Proceed to secondary evaluation." The secondary evaluation took place in a chamber that had clearly been modified extensively since the Iron Templars' arrival. The walls were lined with equipment that bore no resemblance to standard Imperial technology, all organic curves and surfaces that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The lighting came from sources that I could not identify, casting everything in a pale blue radiance that was uncomfortably similar to the glow from Space Marine helmet lenses. The air itself felt different, thicker, more humid, carrying scents that were both familiar and deeply unsettling. I was directed to stand in the center of the chamber, while various forms of scanning equipment were activated around me. Some of the sensors were recognizably technological, banks of cogitators and analysis devices that hummed with electronic activity. Others were more difficult to categorize, organic-looking constructs that seemed to breathe and pulse as they examined me with methods I could not begin to understand. The process was not painful, exactly, but it was profoundly uncomfortable. I could feel the scanners probing not just my physical form but something deeper, examining aspects of my being that I had not known existed. My thoughts seemed to slow and thicken, as if they were moving through some viscous medium, and I found myself experiencing memories and sensations that belonged to someone else entirely. For a brief, terrifying moment, I saw through eyes that were not my own, looking down at a battlefield from a height that no baseline human could achieve, feeling a hunger that was both alien and utterly compelling. Then the scanning stopped, and I was alone in the chamber, with only the sound of my own labored breathing for company. After what felt like several minutes but was probably only a few seconds, the examiner entered the room, consulting fresh data that had apparently been generated by whatever process I had just undergone. "Genetic compatibility confirmed," he said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Psychological resilience within acceptable parameters. Spiritual flexibility, adequate for integration. You have been selected for advancement to full chapter serf status." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I was not entirely certain I wanted to know the answer. "It means," he replied, "that your service to the Emperor is about to take a form that you could never have imagined. Follow me." The induction process that followed is difficult to describe in terms that would be meaningful to someone who has never experienced it. It involved medical procedures that went far beyond anything in standard Imperial practice, psychological conditioning that reshaped fundamental aspects of my personality and understanding, and spiritual preparation that opened my consciousness to truths about the nature of the galaxy that I had been mercifully ignorant of throughout my previous life. The physical changes were the most obvious, though not necessarily the most significant. My muscles were enhanced with additional fibers that provided strength beyond baseline human norms. My bones were reinforced with metallic compounds that made them virtually unbreakable, and my nervous system was modified with implants that allowed me to interface directly with various forms of chapter equipment. My senses were sharpened to a degree that made normal human perception seem like living in a fog, and my reflexes were accelerated to the point where I could track and respond to events that would have been too fast for my previous self to even perceive. But the psychological changes were more profound. The conditioning process methodically stripped away layers of human emotional response that the chapter considered unnecessary or problematic, replacing them with thought patterns that were more conducive to service in their unique role. Fear was not eliminated entirely, but it was restructured into something more useful, a tool for threat assessment rather than a source of paralysis. Compassion was similarly modified, becoming more selective and practical rather than the broad, often irrational concern for others that characterized baseline humanity. Most significantly, my understanding of Imperial doctrine was expanded to encompass truths that are normally hidden from the general population. I learned about the true nature of chaos, about the constant threat posed by alien influences, and about the methods that are sometimes necessary to combat enemies that conventional warfare cannot touch. I was taught to see the galaxy as it really is, not the simplified version presented to ordinary citizens, but the complex, dangerous reality that the Emperor's finest servants must navigate in their service to humanity. The spiritual preparation was the most difficult aspect of the induction process, because it required me to accept concepts that were fundamentally alien to my previous understanding of reality. I learned that the Emperor's plan encompasses strategies and necessities that would horrify baseline humans, but that are absolutely essential for the survival of the species. I was taught to see beyond the surface appearance of Imperial doctrine to the deeper truths that guide the Astartes in their sacred duty, and I learned about the hunger. It began as dreams, at first, vivid, compelling visions of sustenance that went beyond simple physical nourishment to encompass forms of spiritual and psychological feeding that baseline humans could not even conceptualize. The dreams were accompanied by physical changes in my digestive system, modifications that allowed me to process forms of nutrition that would have been toxic to my previous physiology. My sense of taste was altered to find certain substances not just palatable but actively desirable, substances that my rational mind knew should have been repulsive. The first time I fed, truly fed, was 3 weeks into the conditioning process. I was presented with a captured orc not dead, but dying from wounds that had been carefully calculated to ensure maximum viability while preventing any chance of recovery or escape. The creature's blood was still warm, still carrying the vital essence that my modified physiology craved, and when I bit into its neck and felt that rich, coppery fluid flow across my tongue, I experienced a satisfaction so profound that it redefined my understanding of hunger itself. It was not merely physical nourishment, though the alien blood provided nutrients that my enhanced body required for optimal function. It was also psychological and spiritual sustenance, feeding aspects of my being that I had not known existed until they were awakened by the conditioning process. The Orc's life force, primitive and brutal but undeniably potent, flowed into me and became part of my own essence, strengthening me in ways that conventional food could never accomplish. The rational part of my mind, the portion that still remembered being Jerick Voss of the 47th Cardan, was horrified by what I was doing. Everything I had been taught about Imperial doctrine, about the sanctity of life and the proper relationship between humanity and the alien races, screamed that this was wrong, blasphemous, an abomination that no loyal servant of the Emperor should ever contemplate. But that voice was growing weaker with each passing day, overwhelmed by new understanding and new needs that made my previous moral framework seem naive and inadequate. By the time my induction was complete, 6 months after that first day when I had watched the Iron Templars descend from their Thunderhawks, I was no longer quite human. I was something new, something that existed in the space between baseline mortality and the transcendent inhumanity of the Astartes themselves. I was a chapter serf of the Iron Templars, sworn to service that would last until death, dedicated to purposes that were too complex and necessary for ordinary minds to comprehend. My first assignment was to return to the battlefield, where I had witnessed the feeding, now in my capacity as a support specialist for ongoing Iron Templars operations. The Orc threat to Hive Tertius had been eliminated, but there were still pockets of Xenos influence throughout the system that required attention. My role was to assist in intelligence gathering, equipment maintenance, and when the situation required it, the disposal of evidence that might disturb the faith of baseline Imperial citizens. Standing in the ruins of that first engagement site, 6 months after I had knelt there as a terrified ammunition runner, I finally understood what Brother Corvin had meant when he said that some truths were too large for mortal minds. The Iron Templars were not merely warriors, and their service to the Emperor was not the straightforward combat role that Imperial propaganda suggested. They were something far more complex and necessary. Guardians of secrets that humanity needed to be protected from. Wielders of methods that were essential but too disturbing for general knowledge. The feeding was not an aberration or corruption, but a fundamental aspect of their nature and function. The hunger that drove them was not a weakness to be overcome, but a tool to be employed in service to the greater good. The mechanical precision with which they operated was not the result of training alone, but of psychological modifications that allowed them to function in roles that would destroy normal human sanity. And I was no longer separate from that purpose. The conditioning process had made me part of it, a component in the vast machinery that existed to protect humanity from threats it could not even imagine. The horror I had felt at witnessing the feeding had been replaced by understanding of its necessity. The revulsion I had experienced at seeing things that challenged my faith had been transformed into appreciation for the complexity of the Emperor's plan. As I write this confession, decades later, I am no longer the terrified young soldier who carried ammunition for the Iron Templars. I have served the chapter faithfully through dozens of campaigns, have witnessed and participated in activities that would drive baseline humans to madness, have fed on the essence of countless enemies in service to the greater good. My body has been modified beyond recognition, my mind reshaped by experiences that ordinary mortals could never survive, my soul bound to purposes that transcend individual mortality. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between assignments, I remember what it felt like to be human. I remember the weight of that last rifle in my hands, the camaraderie of my fellow guardsmen, the simple certainty of faith that required no complex understanding or troubling compromises. I remember the man I was before I learned the truth about the Emperor's angels, before I discovered what it really means to serve in the darkness between the stars. Most of all, I remember that moment when Brother Sergeant Thorak first looked at me, and I felt the weight of evaluation by something vast and inhuman and utterly certain of its purpose. I remember the fear I felt then, the instinctive recognition that I was in the presence of something that could reshape or destroy me according to its needs. and I understand now that my fear was entirely justified. The Space Marine walked past me that day, and when he did, he changed everything about what I was and what I would become. The man who entered that plaza as Jarek Voss of the Imperial Guard ceased to exist the moment those blue eye lenses fixed upon him, though it took months for the transformation to be completed. In his place stands something that serves purposes too complex for human understanding, sustained by hungers that humanity must never fully comprehend, dedicated to truths that would shatter the faith of any baseline mortal who encountered them. This is what it feels like when a Space Marine walks past you, not the momentary encounter that most humans experience, but the complete reshaping of existence that follows for those who are selected to see beyond the surface of Imperial truth. It is transformation and damnation and enlightenment all at once, a crossing from one form of being into something that can barely remember what it once was. And it is necessary. In this vast, dark galaxy filled with horrors beyond counting, such transformations are not aberrations but requirements. The Emperor's plan encompasses methods and necessities that transcend normal human morality, and those who would serve him most effectively must be prepared to become something more and less than human in the process. I have served faithfully for decades, and I will continue to serve until death takes me, or duty demands a final sacrifice. But I will never forget the weight of that first evaluation, the moment when I ceased to be fully human and began the long journey toward becoming something else entirely. That is the true meaning of encountering the Emperor's angels, not inspiration or salvation, but transformation into something that humanity needs but must never fully understand. The confession is complete. I have told the truth about what it means to serve the Iron Templars, about the prices paid and the necessities accepted in service to the greater good. Let those who read these words understand that the Emperor's protection comes at costs that are carefully hidden from those who benefit from it, and that his angels are far more complex and terrible than the legends suggest. In darkness, we serve. In secrecy, we preserve. In hunger, we find strength. This is the way of the chapter serf, and it is a path from which there is no return. I thought that would be the end of it. That final declaration meant to serve as both conclusion and warning to whatever unfortunate soul might someday discover this record. But the servo skull has not stopped recording, its mechanical eye still glowing with patient expectation, and I realize that my confession is not yet complete. There are events that followed, consequences of my transformation that shaped not just my own fate, but the fates of others. And perhaps those deserve recording as well. It was 7 years after my induction when I learned that transformation is not always a single event, but sometimes a process that continues long after you believe it has ended. I was serving aboard the battle barge Eternal Vigil, attached to Brother Captain Malthius's 3rd Company, as they pursued reports of heretical activity in the Zarian system. My role had evolved beyond simple logistics support to encompass more specialized functions. I had become what the chapter termed a conditioning specialist, responsible for preparing new recruits and captured subjects for various forms of enhanced interrogation. The work suited my modified physiology and psychological framework perfectly. The hunger that had once horrified me had become a tool of precise application, allowing me to extract information from subjects who would have resisted conventional methods indefinitely. The feeding that had initially seemed like alien corruption I now understood as a form of communion, a way of accessing not just the physical sustenance contained in alien blood, but the memories and experiences that came with it. When I fed on a cultist, I didn't merely taste his life. I experienced fragments of his thoughts, caught glimpses of the heretical knowledge that had led him astray, gained insights into the organizational structure and plans of his corrupt brotherhood. This information proved invaluable to the Iron Templars' operational planning, allowing them to strike at enemy networks with surgical precision rather than the broader devastation that might have been required using conventional intelligence-gathering methods. But 7 years of such service had changed me in ways that went beyond the original conditioning. My appearance had grown increasingly distant from baseline human norms, my skin taking on the same translucent quality I had first observed in my examiner all those years ago. My eyes had darkened until they appeared almost black in normal lighting, and my movements had acquired the fluid precision that I had once associated exclusively with the chapter's more senior personnel. Most significantly, the hunger had begun to evolve. What had started as a need for alien blood had gradually expanded to encompass other forms of essence, other types of spiritual and psychological nourishment that I found increasingly difficult to resist. The memories I absorbed during feeding sessions began to linger longer, influencing my thoughts and behavior in ways that suggested I was becoming something more complex than even my enhanced conditioning had anticipated. It was during the investigation of a suspected Genestealer cult on the mining world of Kepler 7th that I first realized how far my transformation had progressed. The cult had been clever, hiding their alien taint behind the facade of a legitimate mining operation for nearly a decade before Imperial intelligence detected the first signs of their true nature. By the time the Iron Templars arrived, the infection had spread throughout much of the planetary population, requiring careful surgical removal rather than the mass purging that might have been employed against a more obvious threat. I was assigned to interrogate captured cult members, using my enhanced capabilities to extract intelligence about the extent of the infestation and the location of key breeding chambers. The work was routine by my standards: restrain the subject, initiate feeding protocols, process the extracted memories for actionable information. But when I began feeding on the third subject, a middle-aged mining foreman who had been turned sometime in the previous year, something unexpected happened. Instead of accessing his memories in the fragmented, impressionistic way I had grown accustomed to, I found myself experiencing them as if they were my own. I was suddenly standing in a tunnel deep beneath the planet's surface, watching as something that was simultaneously beautiful and utterly alien emerged from the darkness ahead. I felt the subject's initial terror transform into wondering acceptance as the creature's psychic influence washed over him, experienced his gradual corruption as alien genetic material began rewriting his fundamental nature. But more disturbing than the vividness of the memories was my reaction to them. Instead of the professional detachment I had developed over years of such work, I found myself responding to the subject's experiences with something approaching understanding, even sympathy. The creature's influence felt familiar in ways that made no sense given my loyal service to the chapter, and the process of genetic corruption seemed less like violation and more like a natural evolution toward something greater. When the feeding session ended, I was left with more than just intelligence about the cult's operations. I retained fragments of the subject's altered consciousness, aspects of his transformed perspective that continued to influence my thoughts long after his death. For the first time since my induction, I found myself questioning not just the methods employed by the Iron Templars, but the fundamental assumptions underlying our mission. The doubt was subtle at first, manifesting as momentary hesitations during routine procedures and occasional flashes of uncertainty about the righteousness of our cause. But as I continued my work throughout the Kepler 7th operation, feeding on more cult members and absorbing more fragments of their alien-influenced consciousness, the questioning grew stronger and more persistent. I began to see patterns in their memories, recurring themes of transformation and transcendence that seemed to offer alternatives to the rigid certainty of Imperial doctrine. Brother Captain Malthius noticed the changes in my behavior before I was fully aware of them myself. He summoned me to his private chambers 3 days before we were scheduled to depart the system, and I found myself once again subjected to the intense scrutiny of an Astartes commander, though now with the additional burden of knowing exactly what such attention might portend. "Your recent performance has been adequate," he said, his power-armored form dominating the chamber despite its considerable size. "Your intelligence gathering has contributed significantly to the success of our operations on this world. However, certain anomalies in your psychological profile have been detected." The statement was delivered in the same mechanical tone I had learned to associate with space marine communication, but I could detect subtle inflections that suggested deeper concern. Brother Captain Malthius was not merely conducting a routine performance review, He was evaluating me for signs of corruption, and we both knew what the consequences would be if his assessment proved unfavorable. "I serve the Emperor faithfully, my lord," I replied, falling back on the response patterns that had been drilled into me during conditioning. "My loyalty to the chapter remains absolute. Loyalty is measured not by words, but by the consistency of thought and action," he said, his helmet's optical arrays focusing on me with mechanical precision. "Your recent feeding sessions have been observed and analyzed. Your reactions to extracted memories show deviations from established norms for chapter personnel. The fact that my private sessions had been monitored should not have surprised me. Nothing aboard an Iron Templar's vessel escaped the attention of the ship's command structure, but the casual way he revealed this surveillance felt like a violation of trust I had not known I still possessed. The subject's memories were more vivid than usual," I said carefully. "Their corruption was deeper than initial estimates suggested. I was forced to process more alien influence than standard protocols anticipate." "Indeed," Brother Captain Malthius agreed, "which is precisely why your reactions are cause for concern. A properly conditioned serf should be able to process such material without deviation from baseline psychological parameters. Your responses suggest that the alien influence is affecting you in ways that were not anticipated during your original preparation." He paused, and I could hear the soft whirring of his armor's systems as they maintained optimal environmental conditions within his sealed suit. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something that might have been regret, though it was difficult to be certain given the Vox distortion. "You have served the chapter well for 7 years. Your dedication has been exemplary, and your specialized capabilities have proven valuable in numerous operations. Under normal circumstances, the changes you are experiencing might be manageable through additional conditioning and careful supervision." The word, however, hung unspoken in the air between us, and I felt the same cold certainty I had experienced that day on the battlefield when I first realized I was being evaluated by something vast and inhuman. "However," he continued, "the nature of your current corruption suggests genetic-level influence that may be beyond our ability to reverse. The alien memories you have absorbed appear to have triggered latent susceptibilities in your enhanced physiology, creating resonances that standard conditioning cannot suppress." "What does that mean for my continued service, my lord?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "It means," he said, "that you have become a liability that the chapter cannot afford to maintain. Your accumulated exposure to alien consciousness has compromised your reliability in ways that pose unacceptable risks to operational security. Termination is the only prudent course of action." The words should have terrified me. A week earlier, they would have sent me to my knees begging for mercy or the chance to prove my continued loyalty. Instead, I found myself experiencing something closer to relief, as if a decision I had been unconsciously avoiding had finally been made for me. "I understand, my lord," I said, and realized that I meant it. "When will the termination be carried out?" Brother Captain Malthius studied me for a long moment, his helmet sensors no doubt analyzing my physiological responses and cataloging them against expected parameters for a condemned serf. "Your acceptance is interesting," he said finally. "Most personnel in your situation display significantly more distress when informed of their impending termination. Your calm suggests that the corruption has progressed further than our initial assessments indicated." "Perhaps," I agreed. "Or perhaps I have simply come to understand truths that the chapter prefers its servants not to contemplate." The moment those words left my mouth, I knew I had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. Brother Captain Malthius's posture shifted minutely, and I could feel the sudden focus of his attention like a physical weight pressing down on me. "Elaborate," he commanded, and there was no question that it was anything other than a direct order. "The subjects I interrogated," I said, finding words for thoughts that had been forming at the edges of my consciousness for days. Their memories contained fragments of perspective that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. They experienced their transformation not as corruption but as evolution, not as loss of humanity but as transcendence beyond human limitations. I paused, aware that I was condemning myself with every word, but unable to stop the flow of revelation that felt like a dam bursting inside my mind. And when I absorbed those memories, when I experienced their thoughts as my own, I began to question whether the chapter's absolute certainty about such matters might be incomplete. Brother Captain Malthius was silent for several seconds, and I could hear the subtle sounds of his armor's systems as they maintained readiness for immediate action. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of what might have been disappointment. "You have confirmed the necessity of your termination," he said. "The corruption has progressed beyond any possibility of reversal. You will be processed immediately." But even as he spoke, I realized that something fundamental had changed in my understanding of the situation. The alien memories I had absorbed were not simply passive recordings of corrupted thoughts. They were active influences that had been gradually reshaping my consciousness, preparing me for possibilities that extended far beyond the narrow parameters of chapter service.